In this, part 7 of our retrospective on MGS2, Sons of Liberty, we'll discuss in detail the game's script. By the end, we'll come to see how, even purely on the page, MGS2 was a hybrid of formats. So the first thing to say is Hideo Kojima is not a programmer. This means that if the MGS2 document is any indication, his writing can sometimes go beyond his staff's abilities to completely recreate in-game. But when we look at the script compared to MGS2 proper, it seems safe to say that KCE Japan did a great job capturing the spirit of every word, even if they couldn't always stay 100% faithful to how MGS2 was written. In the plant's opening scene, for example, the script specifies we'd see monitors that display GPS signals for all the, quote, security forces at work guarding the plant, end quote. We may not see this exactly in the actual game, but we see enough to get the general point it was meant to convey. This brings up one of the best things about the script, however. It often spells out the point of a given scene or even line of dialogue that in-game remains ambiguous, if not completely obscure. We'll be delving into why it's kept obscure by the end of this video. The Big Shell is first described in the script as an alien structure that's shaped, quote, like a giant turtle shell, or to the more fanciful viewer, a hex-shaped area straight out of a sim game, end quote. But like I said, some of the details specified here didn't wind up in the actual game. The water would have become less reflective inside the oil fence, for example, which we would have seen in both above and below surface shots. Throughout the opening scenes, the script self-consciously notes the times at which MGS2 is explicitly supposed to conjure to mind the meme of MGS1. However, Raiden's voice would have been masked originally, like the ninjas somewhat, to make this opening more like the anonymity we found at the start of the tanker. We're also told outright that players who completed the tanker first should be deceived into thinking the events of that mission were part of a VR exercise that we were really playing as Raiden. What's intriguing is how, unlike a traditional screenplay, which leaves a great deal of the presentation and editing to the director and editor, the way MGS2 is written is very specific, for obvious reasons, about when and where codec scenes transition into cutscenes. Some room is still left, however, to the actual devs, whether they want to use, say, in-game renders or Shinkawa illustrations. But one important recurring motif in the script is to match certain scenes in MGS2 with the style, and sometimes even the content of the game's widely seen and celebrated trailers. The continuity between trailers and final release was clearly important to the writers. We even see clips taken from the E3 trailer in the final game during the scene where Snake and Raiden are discussing the Tanker chapter's events. Importantly, this footage, which the script insists frames Snake for the sinking of the tanker, shows him also using weapons that were unavailable in the actual game. One really cool element to the script is how the player's actions represent a kind of black box, which are segmented from the writing by the phrase, "to the game." The player is like one of the characters in the story, except our every move isn't pre-decided, pre-written, like all the rest. It's during these moments that the game mechanics take over to do the narrative heavy lifting in an emergent, unscripted way. But during the scripted scenes, the writers include tons of details that read on the page almost like a novel or a play, much more so than a simple screenplay. In this regard, MGS2 is almost a kind of experiment in storytelling to see if some of these hidden details can be conveyed without the use of explicit words. Snake's sneaking suit is called outdated, while the ribbons of electricity that shoot out of the node, the script identifies as plasma. Rose's appearance is supposed to convey a, quote, somewhat unreal effect, and the way Colonel's visage becomes that of Rose in the codec screen is meant to resemble, quote, almost a morph effect. The really literary moments, however, are when no one is speaking at all, and all the storytelling happens through visuals alone. When Raiden takes the lift to the roof, it's described as a see-through cage coming to life, and a metal forest of girders and supports that, quote, falls out of view at high speed, end quote. The seagulls, quote, wheel with unforced elegance, end quote. Most of the action scenes are similarly detailed and as almost poetic in how they're described. Fortune's aura, for example, is detailed as a queenly pale fire. Other examples of poetic imagery in the script include a description of the pontoon bridge as resembling a serpent, and the setting sun representing EE's fading life. But this invisible degree of detail we also see in the script throughout the many parentheticals offered between words during many dialogue exchanges, particularly those between Rose and Raiden. These not only fill in the ambiguities of tone, they foreshadow revelations the player won't actually uncover until the very end. For example, in one exchange about what day it is tomorrow, when Rose says, "I need all the help that I can get so that I won't chicken out anyway," the script explains this really refers to what Rose has already decided to reveal at the end of the game, quote, the fact that she is a spy as well as her pregnancy, end quote. When Raiden next asks, "Is that why you decided to be part of this mission?" While at home we're only given an ellipsis on Rose's behalf, the script explains it as Raiden's hit, quote, a bullseye, end quote. Another example is the nearly photorealistic AN-94 Russian assault rifle, which the script notes features a, quote, muzzle compensator, one of the Abakan rifle's most recognizable characteristics, end quote. When Colonel says the president was spotted on Strut B, the script explains this as, quote, not an official report, simply an intercept of the SEAL communication, end quote. This point will be made explicit momentarily as Raiden and Colonel listen in on Alpha Team. Originally, Vamp would have worn sunglasses, had chest hair, and Pliskin's hair would have been blonde. But despite these minor missing features, their respective roles, for the most part, remain intact. Another story aspect the script explains outright is that Pliskin's actually faking being badly hurt, so he can watch Raiden from afar. Only then, once he decides Raiden can be trusted, will the real Snake announce himself. The script also says that when Raiden first sees Stillman, he takes him for a bomber at work. We're told that Raiden on high alert is conveyed through a, quote, isosceles stance, and that this scene that plays as Stillman recounts briefly meeting Hal portrays, quote, what Peter remembers from their chopper ride together, end quote. One fascinating exchange happens between Stillman, Pliskin, and Raiden at the end of their only in-person meeting.
The two of us can handle it, don't worry.
But
you'll just slow us down with that leg of yours. There's a war going on here. I don't have time to babysit anymore.
Why don't you just let us handle the grunt work? You can tell us what to do over the radio like in the original mission plan.
all right.
The script says that Pliskin brings up Peter's leg to use cruelty to protect the man from getting hurt, yet to Peter it just makes him nervous that he's been caught in his lie about his injuries. Meanwhile, Raiden tries to play the peacemaker between them, which we're told is exactly how Pliskin, the quote cynical SOB, intended for him to. A number of key motifs are made explicit by the script. One is characters talking really to themselves. From Stillman's words on giving into fear, for example, to Solidus's big speech at the end, characters in MGS2's script are often in denial about who their words are really intended for. Another motif we read occurring a lot, with Olga and Pliskin, is throwing off the player's suspicion through denials and other kinds of misdirects. One example happens when Olga denies she's hiding anything over the radio. She seems to be speaking only to Solidus, when in reality, according to the script, it's the player her words are really meant to deceive.
Are you hiding something from me?
A ton of important but secret details are found in the script. These aren't essential per se, but they explain or contextualize a lot of scenes in intriguing ways. Olga's leap is called Arabian style, for example, while the way the insects swarm to Fortune is described like sheep coming home to their shepherd. The script spells out that Fortune here has assumed Snake disposed of the bombs, solo, and confronts him, quote, to kill him or to be killed by him, end quote. It tells us Ames thinks Raiden understands that he's meant to assassinate President Johnson before the terrorists gain control over the nuke, that Olga, masquerading as Ninja, is explicitly part of the S3 plan, and that Solidus is supposed to resemble a sort of hybrid between Snake and Big Boss. A number of ideas surrounding Solidus and the Patriots got cut, though, from a recitation of past president names as a kind of mantra when we first encounter Solidus, to the Star-Spangled Banner that originally would play during the Patriots' ending speech. And more in-depth explanations about how Raiden's nanomachines work were cut as well. For example, Olga's sword, according to the script, somehow syncs with the nanomachines to induce unconsciousness. And at the end of the script, it's revealed that what we think is Colonel all along has really been a hallucination that the nanomachines generated through, quote, memory manipulation via connecting or stimulating synapses by rearranging a nerve circuit within the dormant part of the brain, end quote. There also would have been more submarine-like ambiance when Raiden first wakes up inside Arsenal Gear's torture room as a subtle callback to the briefing of MGS1. Originally, a montage of the torture scene from MGS1 would have played as well. The torture room, a la the Phantom Pain years after MGS2, would have been, quote, equipped with the latest in medical equipment, end quote. There also would have been, quote, puffs of white vapor that appear each time Solidus and Ocelot breathe out, end quote. When Solidus mentions the Liberian War, originally the Sons of Liberty flag and Liberian flag would have overlapped in the cutscene. The scene would have actually shown footage of a child soldier too. Ironically, when Solidus says to Ocelot, "We'll use him like you suggested," he means Ocelot suggested using Raiden, quote, as bait to draw out any Patriot spies who have infiltrated their organization, end quote. A small detail that speaks to the hyperreality of the scene where you rendezvous with Snake in Arsenal Gear is that his bandana is rippling, quote, despite the absence of any breeze, end quote. An idea that wouldn't be feasible until 2019's Death Stranding, meanwhile, is found in the script's version of the scene where Raiden makes it to the final platform atop Arsenal Gear, where, quote, users can run as long as they want, but the map will not end, end quote. In fact, originally, this entire sequence would have taken place not on the surface of Arsenal Gear initially, but inside a dark and endless hangar, and the rays you fight would have been painted white for winter camouflage. When Olga dies, her blood and brain tissue would have splattered Raiden's face. Only once Raiden regains consciousness after Solidus knocks him out would we have emerged onto Arsenal's surface. It would have been raining too, just like during the tanker chapter. This entire sequence would have teased Arsenal's massive size, gradually revealing more and more until the structure's full extent would have been revealed as it slammed into Manhattan. The script explains that one thing the Patriots did not anticipate was Solidus successfully launching Arsenal Gear. But the biggest differences between the script and the game have to be the ones surrounding the big finale. The Big Shell's location is given as south of Staten Island. When Arsenal heads towards Manhattan, we would have seen it cross beneath the Verrazano Bridge, knock over the Statue of Liberty, and come aground on Battery Park. Arsenal hitting Manhattan would have revealed the full shape of the giant ship for the first time, and have been covered in a cameo by the news anchor from Policenauts, Karen Hojo. The script spells out in painstaking geographic detail the route of the collision, as Arsenal would have torn through New York City, including a moment where Solidus would, quote, shred the New York Stock Exchange flag with his sword, end quote. Arsenal would have destroyed the 28 battery cannons on Battery Park, past the Trinity Church that we see in live-action form at the end of the game, and ground to a halt at Federal Hall, and, quote, knocked the statue of Washington slightly askew, end quote. The fourth wall breaks and meta-narrative of the torture room scene, meanwhile, is also clearer on paper, especially the one line about the camera that Olga makes while the player camera is itself restrained. We're told Raiden knows very little about a mother's feelings for her child, and that Olga knows about Rosemary being one of the Patriot spies. Another awesome scene from the script is when Raiden finally meets the president. It tells us Raiden recognizes Johnson from TV, while the president grabs his groin to check that Raiden isn't the female cyborg ninja, Olga, without her disguise. Raiden's patriotism and how it rapidly dissipates is also made a little clearer on the page. The president, we're told, knows about the S3 plan and connects it to Raiden when the kid says that he's from FOXHOUND, and immediately assumes that Raiden is here to kill him. The president realizes throughout the conversation that even as he's tried to rebel against the Patriots, he's been their unwitting pawn in their S3 plan. There's a line he says about the redesign of Ray from an anti-Metal Gear to a Metal Gear Sentinel being ironic, that the script explains also describes Raiden as a version of Snake going from an anti-Metal Gear to protector of Metal Gear operative. We're also told that the MO disk Raiden's given is actually for wiping out the data on the Patriots dormant inside GW. That the MO disk that Snake hands him is actually a fake, and also that the president's acceptance of his role, quote, acts as a metaphor to foreshadow developments in the player's relationship in the game, end quote. One small thing that got cut was the pictures on all the news reports that Snake shows Raiden. They would have been the ones that the player actually took of Ray in the first chapter. You'll remember that originally only those with save data from MGS1 would have been able to begin MGS2 with the tanker mission. The script states that it would have been here, when Snake finally relays to Raiden the events of that mission, that the tanker chapter would have opened up for new players too, and at a higher difficulty level than normal. We're told that the January 24th, 2000 incident, that really happened by the way, where the NSA facility lost power, actually led to the development of Arsenal Gear, as the isolated location that would be safe from both attack and cyber terrorism. Before the Vamp fight, we're told it's because the skull suit applies pressure and restricts muscle movement that Vamp, perhaps as a nod to Psycho Mantis, can't read Raiden. Originally, EE would have wet herself like Hal. That injection she mentions was really truth serum, and repeatedly we're told that Raiden is incapable of understanding the emotions of others like her. EE's mention of a major experiment to provide complex data for GW to study, little does she realize, is actually a reference to the S3 plan. All in all, the script for MGS2 is its own kind of masterpiece. Another moment that's only explicitly spelled out in the script is during Raiden's confrontation with Fat Man. We're told Fat Man's line, "So you're the one," hints that, quote, he's been ordered by the Patriots to test Raiden, end quote. There would have been the sound of a clock in this scene originally. Fat Man's head would have also been more detailed. His scalp, quote, burned into a reddened terrain of scar tissues, end quote. When Fat Man says, "So that's what's going on, huh?" the script explains that he's figured out Raiden's being lied to, quote, recreate an imitation of Shadow Moses, end quote. Yet another example of intentional deception of the player is explained around Fat Man's use of the word they, when he says, "I could care less what they plan to do." The script states, "they" refers to the Patriots, quote, "but let the users think it to be Solidus and company," end quote. It also explicitly states many of these lines will be properly understood only on a second playthrough. One cool feature that got cut out was when Olga would have said "la-le-lu-le-lo," it would have occurred over static, under which she could almost be heard saying, "the Patriots." There would have been 2 heartbeats you could detect coming from inside Ocelot's chest, which only veterans of the Tanker chapter would have understood. The little insights into Raiden's thoughts in the script are illuminating, to say the least. When Olga says that she's joined up with Snake out of the principle of mutual gain, Raiden, quote, is a little surprised to hear that comment from a native of a communist country, end quote. There are certain differences in tone from how Raiden's supposed to say certain lines and how Quentin Flynn wound up saying them. Are you saying VR is some kind of mind control? He sounds like he's earnestly asking, but in the script it states Raiden's being, quote, needlessly aggressive because he feels his qualifications as a soldier have been belittled by Pliskin, end quote. Similarly, when, near the end, Raiden says to Rose, "It was artificial on my end too, it was just a game, not the real thing," Flynn makes him sound wounded and petulant, but the script says he's to say this line, quote, as if trying to convince himself, end quote. Originally, there would be certain details on screen that maybe weren't yet possible in the PS2 era. For example, Raiden would have entered the big shell through an underwater door encrusted with barnacles. Fat Man's lower half of his face would have been concealed during his last scene, and his smiles would have been purely conveyed, like Die Hardman's expressions in Death Stranding, purely through the eyes. When Snake gives Raiden the ninja blade, Raiden's face would have been reflected in it. These are just a few random examples. Another is when Raiden first spots Solidus. it would have been clearer that his vision is being obscured by the sun, and his sudden darting forward as Snake fires on him would have left, quote, a Back to the Future-esque flame pattern, end quote. Meanwhile, when Vamp runs on water, the oil slick would have been burning on its surface. Rose says, "You have to believe me," with the letters LIE capitalized. The script explains this anomaly as, quote, "There have been so many lies that nothing seems real. The users must decide for themselves." Ties into the underlying theme of finding out what to believe within yourself, end quote. And this is perhaps the most important element worth discussing. In a 1996 interview about Police Knots, Kojima made the following statement: "When players finish a game I've made, I want my feelings to have reached them in one way or another. It's sort of like playing catch, but the ball is the themes I want the audience to receive," end quote. The reason I bring this up has to do with what I said earlier, how the player is almost part of the script, as one of its characters. In MGS2, thanks in part to the PS2, the gameplay is somewhat less linear than any prior Hideo Kojima game. The enemy AI is tuned to provide a relatively large variety of different conditional scenarios. Certain tasks like the bomb disposal or a gathering of dog tags can happen in different order, and nearly every boss can be defeated through a variety of methods. With all these possible differences from one player's experience to the next, we also find just as much variation in terms of different ways to interpret the story. The ball of MGS2, in short, is no longer one totally thrown by Kojima and caught by the player. With MGS2, we have a hand in tossing that ball to ourselves. You could even argue the moral of the game is about learning to recognize our own role, not just in passively receiving, but actively shaping the meaning we find in our lives, particularly in the postmodern 21st century. This idea got first conveyed through Vamp and Pliskin, both of whom step outside the given frame by breaking the fourth wall, albeit in different ways. Vamp is a kind of impossible monster, who's powered, we later learn, by Patriot nanomachines. Yet his function at the start is, just like Pliskin, to puncture the player's sense of context for what constitutes reality. Vamp and Pliskin are introduced to drive inescapably home the reality the player is being lied to. Most of all, lied to by the player ourselves. Yet they both no less serve the related purpose of blurring any discernible line, dividing truth from lie. Vamp and Pliskin simply cannot be real. One's a stock character from fiction, the other an icon from turn-of-the-century video games. Yet through the magic of the digital age, both are rendered to become no more or less real, to quote George Orwell's 1984, as authentically and upon the same evidence as Charlemagne or Julius Caesar. Pliskin tells us that there's a huge difference between actual war and war-based video games, while there's nearly no difference between heroes and madmen. The only real difference between either, however, comes down to the same thing: faith. Except Raiden refuses to acknowledge his faith by insisting there's little distinction worth drawing between, say, VR and live combat exercises. This, notice, is not unlike how Raiden dodges his complicity in deceiving Rose at the end of the game by blaming it on a good-natured desire to save Rose when it's really himself from hurt. I'm saying MGS2 is about belief itself, about not pretending we have no role in shaping what we believe to be true. This paints all the script's details that we don't actually get explicitly spelled out in a new light. They are paradoxically only meaningful because we are free not to know them. They represent in the end a kind of faith in the player, a faith we'll find our own version of MGS2 even without everything spelled out for us, even if we're at least somewhat wrong. One example that's really deceptive is when Vamp sniffs out Snake's true identity. He doesn't say this aloud, but according to the script, Vamp only puts the answer together because Pliskin smells like Solidus. Most players would assume that Vamp recognizes Snake's scent, when it's really one of Snake's clones. After Vamp and Pliskin, MGS2's central existential theme is then conveyed through Fortune, Fatman, and Peter Stillman. Fortune would have hummed the game's ending theme originally, while Stillman and Fatman's heads would have both resembled eggs more clearly. But regardless of these minor changes from the script to the game, all three characters cause the player to struggle with the questions of context and meaning in important ways. Fortune, like Vamp, defies our context for reality, while also believing someone is actually Snake in contradiction to the premises given by the game. The only difference is that Vamp actually gets it right, and Fortune initially gets it wrong by mistaking Raiden for Snake. In fact, in this scene there's a detail not even the writers assert they know for sure in the script. In the footnotes for the name Commander Jackson, the script explains that the Dead Cell leader died in prison after, quote, he was falsely, incarcerated, end quote. Later on, Ocelot will claim throwing Jackson in the brig was all part of the S3 project, but that doesn't rule out the possibility he was thrown in the brig for committing a real crime. The whole point of MGS2, in closing, is that it's impossible, now as maybe ever, to clearly cleave truth apart from lies and false assumptions. Not even the script holds all the facts, just all the poetry. Until next time, boss.